Italy is considered one of the cradles of Western civilization. Its Roman Empire once sprawled all over the Mediterranean Sea and further beyond. Today, more than 15 centuries after the fall of the empire, modern Italy has managed to become one of Europe's main economic powerhouses, alongside Germany, the UK, and France. Its industrial power allowed the country of the Caesars to become the European Union's third richest nation in terms of GDP. However, the country's economic standing is not what it used to be, and it has been suffering a stubborn episode of stagnation for the best part of the last 2 decades. How has Italy gone from an economic powerhouse to stagnation? According to the data of the International Monetary Fund, Italy is, still in 2024, the 9th largest economy in the world. With an estimated GDP of €2.26 trillion, the country has been among the top wealthiest markets globally for the last 40 years. According to the World Economic Forum, by 2030, the country will have fallen to the 15th place. Yet, despite being one of the world's largest, Italy's economic development has always been a tale of strengths and weaknesses. The year 2000 and the turn of the century found the country as a market that had transformed itself successfully from an agrarian economy into one of the most industrialized nations in the world. It was first thanks to the aid of the Marshall Plan, initiated by the US to help Europe recover after World War II. After this, thanks to its full incorporation into European trade and its part in the Middle Eastern oil exploration, Italy experienced years of high growth, where the GDP was expanding at a rate of around 8%. The successful industrial transformation was only achieved partially. While the north of Italy became a highly industrialized area, the middle and southern parts of the country's territory remain underdeveloped. This caused a stark economic contrast between the prosperous north and a more agrarian and less wealthy rest of the country. Later on, despite having an economy that was losing its stamina, Rome managed to keep the country on track towards growth thanks to the advantages brought by its integration into the European Union first, and the adoption of the euro as their official currency after that. In the early 2000s, Italy's production was highly specialized and focused on products that had a high degree of added value, such as machinery, vehicles, pharmaceuticals, and products with a special knack for design mastery, such as furniture and fashion. This kind of industrial output allowed them to become one of the world's largest exporters of manufactured products. These advantages were, sadly, not enough to keep a strong growth rate. Between the years 1996 and 2000, the nation only achieved a meager 1.2% average growth rate, significantly lower than the European Union's average of 2.28%, and below the golden standard of 1.5% growth. At the same time, the country suffered from other economic shortcomings. Firstly, its informal economy would take up to an estimated 25% of its GDP. Tax evasion and fraud were business as usual. And then the fact that such a large portion of Italy's economy was hidden from the eyes of the state, the abilities of Rome to influence its performance. Italy has also traditionally dealt with lower productivity growth, a feature that has often been linked with outdated practices like nepotism, which undermine meritocracy and thus provoke a suboptimal allocation of labor force and resources. Despite being a relatively important economy in the world, Italy, alongside Spain, Portugal, and Greece, was one of the most battered European countries during the 2008 financial crisis. In the European boot, the Great Recession ended up having long-lasting and profound effects on the country's finances, further complicating pre-existing deficiencies and triggering failures such as a steep economic contraction, rising unemployment, and increased national debt. By 2009, the Italian GDP was contracting at a 5.3% annual rate, a level of shrinkage that was only seen in the nation after World War II. The financial sector was subjected to a high degree of stress as a consequence of a crisis that cast serious doubts over Europe's banking systems. Italian banks, however, thanks to a lower exposition to international markets, fared relatively well. The sector was sound and remained better sheltered than many of its neighbours' banking ecosystems. The public debt of Italy, on the other hand, was a whole other matter. Due to very high exposure to government bonds and because of the near-total credit crunch that the crisis caused throughout the European Union, banks had a considerable shortage of credit around 2011, thus triggering a massive contraction of the economy. As in other southern European countries, the unemployment rate spiked as a consequence of the crisis. It reached 12.7% by 2014. Also, as in other southern European countries, it affected with the most virulence to a specific group within the Italian population, the youth. Those who were just entering the labour market found an unemployment rate that ended up hovering above 40%. Whereas Italy has managed to lower the unemployment rates after the crisis, there is another consequence of the crisis whose effects have been largely unaddressed: the stagnation of wages. This is, again, similar to what has happened in other southern European countries, and related to the poor performance of the country in productivity growth. Italy's productivity has been majorly stagnated since the year 2000. Then, due to poorly designed and executed subsequent attempts at reforming the country's economy, the productivity growth rate stopped itself and has never really picked up. Between 1999 and 2019, the real GDP per hour in Spain, France, and Germany grew by 17%, 21%, and 22% respectively. Italy's, on the other hand, only yielded a 5% growth. Italy's problem with productivity is mainly caused by two factors. First is the country's chaotic political life, which has ended up causing the judiciary to be incapable of dealing with legal problems effectively, and a long array of failed economic and labour reforms. The second factor is a consequence of those problems, and is having a public sector largely inefficient. According to the OECD, investors and households perceive public institutions' integrity and effectiveness to be among the weakest across OECD countries, and households report lower satisfaction than in other OECD countries in many public services, including education, security and crime prevention, and environmental protection. This, in a nation in which companies are highly dependent on the public sector, is a factor that inhibits productivity and also adds to the ever-growing public debt of Italy. Above 100% of the GDP since the 90s, the nation's government debt grew almost 20 percentage points between 2009 and 2019, and in 2024 is on the verge of reaching 140%. Moreover, Italy faces a stark problem due to its ever-declining fertility rates. Births in Italy have been falling for the last 15 years. The problem has gotten to a point in which last year, the country set a new record for low fertility rates, with 379,000 babies born in 2023, the lowest since the unification of the country in 1861. The lack of births is causing the Italian population to age, a bad sign when it comes to future growth prospects. It is not only associated with lower productivity, but also with a shrinkage of the labour force as smaller portions of the total population become eligible to work. In 2020, Italy suffered a strong blow due to the coronavirus pandemic. As the travel and touristic sectors account for a rather big portion of Italy's economy, the forced travel bans and the stoppage of international tourism had an outsized impact on the country. There was another reason that contributed to making the COVID-19 impact on Italy bigger. The European nation was especially vulnerable in the face of a pandemic such as the one the COVID-19 virus triggered, due to the relatively large amount of young Italians that were sharing living space with their older relatives. This is a testament to the Italian strong family bonds and lack of support for the youth's emancipation. And so, by the end of 2020, the GDP of the nation had fallen 9%. This decline was comparatively bigger than the ones experienced by other countries, such as the 8% fall in France, the 5.1% in Germany, or the meager 3.5% of the US. The fact is that nowadays the economic performance lags behind many of its European peers. Yes, it is true that lately Italy's growth has outpaced that of other European economic powerhouses, such as Germany. That has been the tone for the last few years. For example, in the last quarter of 2023, Italy's GDP grew at 0.5%, while Germany's was shrinking at a 0.3% pace. This year, per the EU estimates, Germany will grow at a rate of 0.1%, while Italy will outpace it by growing closer to a 0.9% rate. This growth, however, doesn't paint the full picture. Other European nations are growing at a considerably faster rate. This is the case in Greece. The once considered slowest pupil of the European Union will outpace Italy by growing a full 2.2% in 2024. Other EU nations will fare even better, like Croatia and Romania, and their 3.3% GDP estimated growth for 2024, or Poland, growing at 2.8% this year. One of the reasons behind Italy outpacing other countries such as Germany has a lot to do with the benefits of their access to a consistent flow of European funds. The Mediterranean country has been one of the main beneficiaries of the EU's COVID recovery funds. By February 2024, the government had already allocated around 45% of the €102 billion sent their way by the European Union. If the country manages to maintain the spending pace and dodge the deadlines, by 2026 it could be the European nation that has received more money from the Union to fight COVID-19 consequences in absolute terms, for a total of €194.4 billion. According to Rome's estimates, the EU's cash injection may boost their GDP by 3.4 percentage points by 2026. But to be able to access all the funds, Rome is going to have to step up its game. The EU has already had to address the country's government several times for falling behind the policy milestones that are required to access the funds. In any case, the economic problems for Italy are deep-rooted in the country's system. Addressing them requires a series of reforms aimed at the long term. The structural shortcomings of the country will likely continue, limiting its potential growth at least for the next years.